They burned his wife alive. Not a metaphor, not a theological footnote. The Philistines dragged her from the house and set fire to her because she had married the wrong man, and the wrong man had burned their grain fields in response, and the fields burned because of a riddle, and the riddle started because of a wedding, and the wedding happened because a terrifying force in the desert had already decided, before any of these people were born, how all of it would end. This is the story they turned into a children's fable. The man with the magic hair, the woman with the scissors, the moral lesson about the dangers of trusting foreigners. Forget every version of that story you have been told. What actually happened in the ancient borderlands between Israel and the Philistine Pentapolis is something altogether darker. Something that makes the violence in every war movie you have ever watched feel like a stage production. Because the real story of Samson is not a romance that went wrong. It is the deployment log of a biological weapon. And the most terrifying part is not what the weapon did. The most terrifying part is who built it and why. And the fact that the builder did not consider Samson's suffering a cost. The builder considered it a mechanism. Stay with that, because by the time this is over, you will never read the word blessing the same way again. The Israelites were comfortable. That is the detail no one tells you first, because it ruins the conventional framing of the story. The common assumption is that the people of Israel were groaning under Philistine boots, crying out to heaven for a liberator. That is not what the text says. What the text says is far more disturbing. The Israelites were integrating. They were intermarrying with Philistines, trading with Philistines, speaking Philistine, eating Philistine food, worshipping at the edges of Philistine culture. The occupation was working, not through conquest, but through the slow erosion of identity. The Philistines were not destroying Israel with armies. They were dissolving it with commerce and proximity. And the Israelites were not crying out to God about this. They were not crying out at all. Into this silence, a very specific kind of answer arrived. The angel of the Lord descended on a barren woman in the hill country of Dan. Her name is never recorded in the text, which tells you something about who the encounter was actually for. The angel did not come to comfort her, or celebrate her, or promise her joy. The angel came to deliver a blueprint. Cold, precise, military. Your womb, the entity announced, has been repurposed. The child you will carry will be consecrated to God from before his birth. And then it laid out the specifications of the consecration with the clinical detail of an armaments contract. No wine, no fermented drink, no grapes, not even raisins. No razor will touch his head. No contact with the dead. These were not lifestyle suggestions. In the legal framework of ancient Israel, these were the parameters of the Nazirite vow, derived from the Hebrew root nazir, meaning separation, meaning set apart, meaning removed from the ordinary traffic of human existence. The vow was typically voluntary, typically temporary. An individual might undertake it for a season, seeking a period of intense closeness to God, and then return to regular life when the season ended. Samson's vow was neither voluntary nor temporary. It was imposed before he had lungs to breathe with. It would not end until he was dead. And it was not designed to bring him closer to God in the soft, interior sense that phrase usually implies. It was designed to make him into something that could not exist peacefully inside human society. Because peaceful integration was exactly what God was trying to prevent. Think about what the wine restriction meant in the ancient Near East. The vineyard was the center of everything: communal celebration, seasonal festivals, wedding feasts, the ordinary lubrication of human friendship. To abstain from the vine was to stand outside every circle of belonging that ancient society offered. No numbing, no softening. Samson was forced to experience everything he experienced with absolute, grinding lucidity. Every humiliation, every act of violence, every moment of loneliness. He did not get to drink it away. He did not get to blur the edges. And the hair. In the ancient Semitic world, the state of untamed, wild, heavily matted hair was called pera. It was the visual language of the wild man warrior, the figure who existed on the feral edge of civilization, outside its rules, beyond its protection. The Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh gives us Enkidu, the creature of the wilderness, whose hair grows matted and wild before he is civilized by a woman and domesticated into a companion for the king. In that tradition, the wild hair is the condition you cure. It is the thing you grow out of when you join society. Samson would wear the pera for his entire life. He would never be cured. He would never be domesticated. Because he was not meant to join the society he was born into, he was meant to make that society impossible. The prohibition on touching the dead deserves its own moment of attention. The Nazirite could not grieve over a corpse, could not attend a burial, could not touch even his own dead parents without violating his consecration. This is a religious requirement that severs the most fundamental human bonds. Grief is how humans process violence and loss. Grief is how communities absorb the shock of death and continue living. Samson was categorically denied that mechanism. And yet his operational mandate required him to create death. Hundreds of it. Eventually thousands. He was forbidden to touch corpses. He was ordained to produce them. This is the psychological architecture of a man who had never been designed to function, who had been engineered for a single purpose and then left to find a way to live inside a body designed for destruction. Manoah, his father, questioned the angel. He wanted more details. He wanted to know the child's future. The angel deflected. What the angel would not tell Manoah is what the text makes obvious by the end of the story. The child had no future in the conventional sense. He had a function. He had a detonation point. The angel had come to arrange the delivery of ordnance, not to guarantee the survival of the delivery vehicle. When Samson was born, he came into a world that would never quite know what to do with him. He was visually distinct, his wild hair marking him immediately as other, as consecrated, as dangerous. His parents understood, with the slow, dawning horror that the text hints at in their anxious, repeated questioning of the angel, that they were not raising a son. They were housing a weapon. And they did not know when it would go off, or how much of the world around it would burn when it did. The boy grew. The Spirit of the Lord began to move in him. The text uses that phrase early, casually, as if it is unremarkable. It is not unremarkable. The thing that moved in Samson had a name and a method, and what that method looked like up close was something no one in the history of Israel had seen before. Because what you need to understand, before the story gets any further, is that Samson's strength was never his own. And what that means is a great deal more terrifying than any Sunday school teacher ever warned you. Here is what the scholars almost never say plainly. Samson was not strong. He was possessed. The distinction matters in ways that reach all the way to the end of the story, to the blind man in the dark, with his hands pressed against two pillars, about to bring a building down on 3,000 people. Because if Samson was simply a man born with extraordinary physical gifts, then the narrative is a tragedy of wasted potential. But if Samson was a biological conduit for something violent and divine, something that did not ask his permission before it entered him, then the narrative is something else entirely. It is a story about what it feels like to be used. The verb is tzalach. Watetzlach alav ruach Yahweh. The Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him. Not filled, not indwelled, not descended peacefully into his waiting heart. The word tzalach carries the weight of a predatory strike, a violent ambush. It translates more accurately as struck mightily or rushed upon with overwhelming force. It is the same kind of language you would use to describe a lion launching itself at prey. And that is not a coincidence, because the first time the spirit rushes upon Samson in the text, a lion is involved. He was walking to Timnah to meet the Philistine woman he had decided to marry, because he had decided it was the right thing to do. Because what Samson wanted was almost always the worst possible diplomatic decision, and yet almost always the right tactical one. God was using his appetites the way a general uses terrain, and on the road a young male lion came out of the vineyards toward him. The spirit struck, and Samson tore the lion apart with his bare hands. Not wounded, not drove away, tore it apart. The text compares it to tearing a young goat, the kind of casual, effortless destruction a man might apply to something small and weak. Samson applied it to an apex predator. And then he told no one. He walked on to Timnah and greeted his future wife and said nothing about the dead lion in the vineyard, because this was not, for Samson, a remarkable enough event to mention. Picture what that means for his daily psychological experience. The thing that could do that lived inside him. The thing that could seize his nervous system and transform him into something that could dismantle an adult lion with its hands was present, constantly, sleeping just beneath the surface of every ordinary moment. Every interaction he had with another person, he knew that this was possible, and he could not control when it would happen. He could not turn it on. He could not turn it off. The next time the spirit struck, it was in the Philistine city of Ashkelon, and the cause was breathtakingly petty. He had set a riddle at his wedding feast, a trick question built on a private experience he had not shared, about honey found in the carcass of that same lion he had killed. The Philistine groomsman, unable to solve it, had pressured his new wife into extracting the answer from him. And she had, and they had given him the answer on the last day, and his response was the response of a man who had been publicly humiliated and whose pride had just found a detonation point. The spirit rushed in. He walked to Ashkelon, a Philistine city he had no personal grievance with, found 30 men who had done him no harm, killed them, stripped their bodies of their festive garments, and carried those garments back to pay the wager. 30 men. For a riddle. This is the part where the theological machinery becomes visible and uncomfortable. Because the Spirit did not rush in to stop him from doing something monstrous, the Spirit rushed in to enable it. God used Samson's wounded vanity as the ignition sequence for a political assassination. 30 members of the Philistine upper class died because the divine strategy required blood between the two peoples, required a widening of the wound that would prevent integration, required the peaceful assimilation project to remain permanently disrupted. God was not surprised by Samson's rage. God designed it. God needed it. Samson's character flaws were not obstacles to the divine mission. They were the fuel. The Lehi Massacre is where this becomes genuinely hard to look at directly. He had come back to collect his wife, only to find that her father had given her away to someone else in his absence, assuming Samson was done with her. So Samson caught 300 foxes, tied them in pairs by their tails, attached burning torches to the knots, and released them into the Philistine grain fields. The standing grain, the vineyards, the olive orchards, all of it burned. The Philistines, searching for who was responsible, found the answer. Samson's father-in-law had given his wife to another man, so they burned the father-in-law and his daughter alive. Samson then declared he would be avenged for this, which raises the disturbing question of whether he understood that this particular catastrophic domino had been set in motion by his own original absence, and the evidence suggests he did not spend a great deal of time on that question. He struck the Philistines' hip and thigh, the text says. A great slaughter. The Philistines mobilized. They marched into Judah. They demanded Samson be handed over. And here is the detail that reveals everything about the geopolitical reality of this moment. The men of Judah went to Samson themselves, 3,000 of them, to bind him and hand him over. Not to fight the Philistines, to hand over Samson, because they had made their peace with the occupation. Because peace, even an occupied peace, was preferable to war. Because Samson was the problem, not the Philistines. He let them bind him. He walked with them. And then the Spirit struck. His restraints snapped like burning flax. He reached down and picked up a jawbone from a donkey's carcass, which was a ritually defiling object, which he should not have been touching, which he touched anyway, because the Spirit was not interested in ritual consistency at this moment. The Spirit was interested in soldiers. He killed 1,000 men with a jawbone. 1 man, 1 rotting bone, 1,000 soldiers. The aftermath is the most human moment in the entire first half of the story. After the Spirit left him, he collapsed and cried out that he was dying of thirst, that God had given him this great deliverance, and now he would die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised. There is something raw and exhausted in that prayer that the triumphant framing of the battle tends to obscure. He was wrung out, not triumphant, hollowed. The thing that had used his body had departed and left behind a man sitting on a hill of dead Philistines, parched and shaking. God opened a hollow place in the ground, and water came out. Samson drank. The text says his spirit returned and he revived. His spirit returned, as if it had gone somewhere else when the other spirit was present. What does it feel like to be the host of something like that, and then to have it leave? What does the silence sound like after? Samson had no one to ask. He had no peers who shared his experience, no tradition of other Nazirites by birth to draw on, no framework for understanding what was happening to him. He had his wild hair and his abstentions and his parents' anxious love, and a God who visited him in violence and departed in exhaustion. So he went to Gaza and visited a prostitute, because the loneliness had to go somewhere. The Philistines heard he was in the city and waited at the gate all night, planning to kill him at dawn. Samson rose at midnight, found the city gate locked, tore the gate and its posts and its bar off the wall, and carried the entire assembly to the top of a hill outside the city on his shoulders. He was not escaping. He was not fleeing in fear. He carried their gate to a hill and left it there, like a signature, like a message, like a man who knew exactly how impossible he was. But something in him was fraying. The loneliness of the para-hair, the isolation of the vow, the repeated experience of being seized and released by a force that treated his body as equipment, the desperate and always disastrous hunger for human connection. All of it was accumulating. And somewhere in the valley of Sorek, where the cultures blended and the borders blurred, there was a woman named Delilah. She was already waiting. But what Delilah actually was, what the people who hired her were planning, and how they calculated the exact price of a living weapon of mass destruction, is a story that requires its own reckoning. Because the number they settled on was 5,500 pieces of silver. And the number that you are probably thinking of for the most famous betrayal in Western history is 30. The difference between those two numbers will tell you everything about how the Philistines classified Samson. And nothing you think you know about Delilah has prepared you for what that classification meant. Before we talk about what Delilah did, we need to talk about who paid her. Because the Sunday school version of this story positions her as a scheming woman who seduced a foolish man, the actual text positions her as a state-sponsored intelligence operative, executing a high-value asset neutralization with an unlimited black ops budget. The difference is not merely one of framing. The difference changes everything about what Samson's eventual confession means, and why it has haunted interpreters for 3,000 years. The 5 Seranim were the Axis lords of the Philistine Pentapolis: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gath. 5 city-states, 5 rulers, the entire governing apparatus of the most organized military culture in the ancient Near East. These were not local bosses or regional administrators. They were the supreme command of a nation that had iron weapons, professional soldiers, and a geopolitical hegemony stretching across the coastal plain of Canaan. And all 5 of them, collectively, went to Delilah. Each one offered her 1,100 pieces of silver. 5 lords, 1,100 pieces each. 5,500 pieces of silver total. Weigh that. Roughly 63 kilograms of solid silver. In the Iron Age, that kind of liquidity funded dynasties. It built armies. It sustained a city-state for seasons. Judas Iscariot, betraying the Messiah of the world's largest religion, received 30 pieces. Delilah's contract was 183 times more expensive than the life of Jesus Christ. The Philistine High Command did not think they were hiring a woman to manipulate a lovesick man. They were deploying the equivalent of a modern intelligence agency against a target they classified at the absolute top of their threat matrix. They were paying whatever it cost to find the vulnerability in a weapon that had killed thousands of their people and showed no signs of stopping. Delilah agreed. She was not reluctant. The text offers no internal conflict, no hint of affection that wars with calculation. She assessed the situation, assessed the payment, and began the operation. The methodology was psychological warfare, conducted over an extended period of intimate access. She asked him directly where his strength came from. He lied. She used the lie against him, called in the Philistine soldiers who had been stationed in an adjacent room, revealed the deception. He escaped. She asked again. He lied again. She bound him with the method he had described. The soldiers came. He broke free again. 3 times. She caught him in 3 different lies, and each time the soldiers were there, waiting, revealed. And he still came back. This is the moment that no commentator quite knows what to do with, because it seems irrational. He knew she was an enemy operative. He had seen the soldiers. He had experienced 3 times the exact sequence of her extracting information and deploying it against him. And he stayed. And he came back. And he smiled, or he sulked, or he did whatever the private dynamic of their relationship required. And then she asked again. The theological interpretation tends toward weakness of the flesh, toward lust overcoming judgment. The psychological interpretation is considerably more complex and considerably more sympathetic. Samson was not too stupid to recognize a trap. He had demonstrated enough tactical cunning in his earlier exploits to make stupidity an unconvincing explanation. What Samson had in the Sorek Valley in Delilah's house was the only thing resembling a home he had ever been able to construct. She saw him. She looked at him directly, without the fear or the awe or the calculated deference that everyone else offered a man who could tear a city gate from its hinges. The very fact that she was willing to try to bind him, to challenge his strength, to probe at his power rather than flee from it, suggested a willingness to engage with him as something other than a weapon. He was playing games. He knew he was playing games. He was stringing along the intelligence operation because the operation gave him someone who was genuinely trying to understand him, even if the understanding was weaponized. It was the closest thing to intimacy the vow had ever allowed him. But the text says she pressed him daily with her words until his soul was vexed unto death. Daily. Unrelenting. The nagging that the text describes is not the petulant pestering of a disappointed partner. It is a sustained psychological attrition campaign, designed to wear down resistance through exhaustion rather than argument. And Delilah was funded by 5 governments. She had the resources, the time, and the strategic patience to simply outlast him. And underneath the exhaustion, something darker was happening in Samson. He was tired. Not physically tired. Not tired of Delilah or the Sorek Valley or the games they played. He was tired of the para hair. Tired of the absolute sobriety, the full-time lucidity that the vow required, the inability to blur even one edge of the endless, violent experience of his existence. Tired of being a weapon. Tired of the rushes of the spirit that hijacked his body and replaced him with something else and left him sitting in a field of corpses, gasping, alone. He wanted to be weak like any other man. That sentence, which he eventually speaks aloud to Delilah, is the most tragic sentence in the book of Judges. He did not want to win. He did not want victory or glory or the gratitude of a people who had literally handed him to the enemy 3 times. He wanted to not be what he was. He wanted the crushing, isolating, violent divine ownership to end. Telling Delilah the truth was not a failure of judgment. It was the most deliberate choice he had ever made. A subconscious act of self-destruction, yes, but deliberate. He chose to end himself. He chose the razor over the jawbone, the silence of abandonment over the terrible, seizing rush of the spirit. He chose ordinary human frailty. He told her everything. The hair, the vow, the covenant that bound the divine power to the physical mark on his body. She let him sleep. She called for a man to shave his head. The bronze razor scraped across his skull in the dark, and with each pass across the scalp, something older and greater than Samson's own consciousness felt the covenant shredding. When he woke, the Philistines were already there. And the text delivers its most chilling sentence with almost no inflection at all. He did not know that the Lord had left him. Not departed reluctantly, not withdrawn in sorrow. Left. The divine entity that had crashed into his nervous system at Timnah and Ashkelon and Lehi, that had snapped his restraints and armed him with bone and shattered a lion with his hands, simply was not present anymore. The consecration was broken. The weapon was disarmed. And Samson did not know it yet. He shook himself, the text says. He tried to summon what had always come before. He reached for the familiar violence, the overwhelming rush, the predatory strike of the spirit. He found nothing. Ordinary muscle, ordinary fear, ordinary, fragile human being. The Philistines took him. They drove spikes into his eyes, not as an afterthought, not as battlefield injury, as a deliberate precision act of domination. A warrior without eyes cannot judge distance, cannot target, cannot orient himself in space. An eyeless Samson was not merely defeated, he was decommissioned. They bound him in heavy bronze shackles and dragged him south to Gaza, the city whose gate he had carried on his shoulders in the dark, and they put him to work grinding grain. The prison, the grinding wheel, the dark. This is where the story stops being about strength and begins being about something else entirely. Something that happens in a man when everything has been taken and he has nothing left to do but walk in circles in the dark, and the weapon that he used to hate carrying has been removed, and the silence where the spirit used to live is the loudest thing he has ever heard. Because the silence did not last. His hair had started to grow again. No one noticed. The guards in the Gaza prison had no reason to watch a broken man's scalp in the dark. He was chained to the grinding mill, the techon, that massive circular stone that the lowest class of female slaves operated in the ancient Near East, and he walked his circular path, and the grain turned to powder, and somewhere in the grinding darkness, the hair was growing back. The text inserts this detail with deliberate quietness. It does not frame it as hope. It does not sound like redemption. It sounds, if you pay attention to what comes immediately after, like a weapon being reloaded. Think about what the grinding mill meant. Dagon, the principal deity of the Philistine Pentapolis, was worshipped as a god of grain and agricultural abundance. The entire theology of the Philistine coastal civilization was bound up with the fertility of the grain harvest, the produce of the flat, rich land between the sea and the hills. And they had taken the former champion of Yahweh and put him to work serving that produce. Every rotation of the millstone was an act of ritual submission. Samson's broken body, walking endless circles in the dark, was powering the enemy's economy, while simultaneously serving as a daily, public demonstration that the God of Israel had been defeated by the God of grain. The Philistines were conducting theology with his suffering, and for a while, it worked. But something happens to a person when everything is taken, when the ego is stripped, when the appetites are exhausted, when the desperate attempts to bridge the gap between divinity and humanity have all catastrophically failed. When there is nothing left but darkness and the sound of stone on stone, and the specific, precise humiliation of being a living sacrifice to the enemy's God. Samson had spent his entire life fighting the wrong enemies. The Philistines who died at Ashkelon and Lehi and Timnah, the 300 foxes and the gates and the jawbone, the chaotic, improvised violence of a man who felt everything too intensely and understood almost nothing about his own purpose. He had used the divine power for personal vengeance, for wounded pride, for the specific, petty scale of a man who could not see past his own immediate experience. In the prison, with his eyes gone and the circles unending, he finally stopped fighting the wrong enemies. He stopped fighting at all. He became what the divine strategy had always required, an empty vessel. No ego to rout around, no appetites to exploit, no desperate human longing for connection to misdirect the divine energy into foolish places. Just a man, walking in circles, waiting. The Philistines threw a festival. The 5 Seranim gathered in the great temple of Dagon in Gaza to offer a massive victory sacrifice and celebrate what they had achieved: the neutralization of the greatest military threat Israel had ever produced. The hall was filled with the complete leadership apparatus of the Philistine Pentapolis: rulers, generals, high priests, political architects, the entire command structure of the coastal empire. And outside, on the flat roof of the temple, 3,000 more citizens had gathered to look down into the courtyard and watch the celebration. They called for Samson. The Hebrew word for what they wanted from him is sachak. It implies ritual mockery, physical sport, a performance of humiliation. They wanted the broken champion of Yahweh to perform for Dagon, to demonstrate before the god of grain and the entire gathered leadership of the Philistine world what defeat looked like. They wanted his broken body to be a sermon about who had won. They led him out of the prison on the arm of a servant, into the noise, into the heat of sacrificial fires, into the thick, sweet, choking smell of incense and roasted meat offered to stone, into the deafening mockery of 3,000 people who had spent 40 years in terror of what this man could do. He asked the servant to let him feel the pillars. He wanted to lean against them, he said. He was tired. The servant did not hesitate. He guided the scarred hands to the wood. Now you need to understand the architecture. The main hall of the Philistine temple, as established by the excavation at Tel Kassil and confirmed by parallel sites at Ekron and Gath, bore its roof weight on two central pillars, placed along a center axis, spaced approximately 2 meters apart, roughly 7 feet, exactly the wingspan of a large, powerful man. Samson's right hand found one pillar, his left hand found the other. He was positioned at the exact geometric heart of the building's structural vulnerability, and no one in the room knew it. The architects knew it, perhaps, but they were celebrating. The engineers who had built this place were proud of it, rightfully. It was a beautiful building. It held its weight elegantly. It would hold for generations. Samson prayed. This is the moment where the narrative reveals what it has always been about. Not love, not hair, not the dangers of temptation, but the question of what a person becomes when they finally, completely, without reservation, embrace what they were made for. His prayer is not a prayer for forgiveness, not a prayer for peace or reconciliation or the spiritual comfort that religious language usually promises. It is a raw, specific, military demand for violent reciprocity. O Lord Yahweh, remember me. Strengthen me just this once, O God. Let me take vengeance on the Philistines for my 2 eyes. The Hebrew word chazak, which he uses for strengthen, carries the weight of military, offensive, defensive power. He was not asking to be saved. He was asking to be loaded one final time. He had stopped wanting to be weak like any other man. The prison had burned that desire away. The crucible of the Techon and the darkness and the shameless public humiliation had completed the process that all the chaotic years of his active service had failed to accomplish. He was no longer a man who happened to be a weapon. He was, finally, entirely, only the weapon. Let me die with the Philistines. The spirit struck. Not the slow return of confidence or the gradual rebuilding of muscle. The tzalach. The violent, overwhelming rush. The predatory strike of the divine entity into a body that had been emptied of every competing desire. His veins filled, his muscles locked. The scarred sockets of his empty eyes opened wide in the direction of nothing, and nothing looked back. And the divine force that had been waiting for this empty vessel poured in without resistance, without the friction of ego, without the noise of a man who wanted to be human. He bent. The Hebrew verb is natah, to press down under massive weight, to exert monumental, sustained, structural force. The wooden pillars shifted on their stone bases. 2 meters of ancient timber, bearing thousands of tons of stone and human body weight, began to move sideways off their foundation points. The structural integrity of the main hall failed in an instant. The roof did not crack. It did not groan and warn and give people time to run. It fell. All of it at once, thousands of tons of stone and timber and human beings, dropping straight down into the hall, crushing the leadership of the Philistine Empire in a single, absolute second. The sound would have been impossible. A roar beyond the category of ordinary loudness, the kind of sound that reaches past the ears into the body and reorganizes the bones. Dust in volumes that blacked out the sky, the smell of limestone shattered into powder, of fresh blood meeting open air, of timber snapping under weights it was never designed to support. And then, silence. The text says he killed more at his death than he killed in his entire life. He was buried by his brothers, who came down from the hill country to find what was left of him in the rubble. The text says his family took him up and buried him in the tomb of Manoah, his father. A sentence of 10 words in the English translation, for the end of a life that had consumed 4 chapters and 40 years of the most violent geopolitical history in the ancient Near East. His tenure as judge had lasted 20 years. His impact on Philistine military and political capacity was, by the standards of the ancient world, catastrophic. The concentrated command structure of the Pentapolis, gathered in a single building for a victory celebration, had been eliminated in a building collapse. The Philistine Pentapolis would continue for another century, would trouble Israel under Saul and David, would eventually recede into history. But the specific campaign of cultural assimilation that had been dissolving Israelite identity in the period of the Judges was interrupted. The borderlands were no longer safe. The comfortable integration was over. God had deployed a weapon, and the weapon had detonated exactly where it was placed. What the weapon had wanted, whether it had wanted anything at all, or whether there was a man inside the ordnance who had dreams and hungers and a desperate desire for a single normal day, is a question the text raises and declines to answer. The brothers took what was left of him home and buried him next to his father. And now here is the thing about Samson that no one says in the sermon. His greatest strength was never the spirit. It was the loneliness. The hair that marked him as other, the sobriety that kept him unblurred, the prohibition on grief that left him unable to process the violence he was ordained to produce. All of it conspired to make him so fundamentally unintegratable into either culture, Israelite or Philistine, that integration itself became impossible around him. The very qualities that made him a catastrophe as a human being made him a masterpiece as a strategic instrument. The divine plan did not work in spite of his flaws. The divine plan was his flaws. And here is the question that makes this story feel like it was written about right now, not 3,000 years ago. You have probably met someone whose entire life seemed to be a series of disasters and broken relationships and reckless choices that somehow, from a distance, traced a line towards something that mattered. Someone whose inability to be ordinary turned out to be the only thing that changed anything. Someone whose loneliness and hunger for connection drove them repeatedly into enemy territory, and whose failures at peace accidentally prevented something worse. You have probably wondered whether that person was cursed or chosen, whether the suffering was punishment or design. Samson never got an answer to that question. The spirit came and went and never explained itself, never offered consolation, never told him whether the damage had been worth it. He carried the para-hair and the sobriety and the loneliness and the God that visited him in violence, and he carried all of it to the end. So here is what you have to decide. If you had been one of the men of Judah, the 3,000 who came down the hill to bind Samson and hand him to the Philistines because the peace of occupation was preferable to the war of liberation, would you have done the same? Or, if you had been Samson himself, given the choice between one normal life and the catastrophic, holy, blood-soaked purpose that was written into your cells before you were born, which would you choose? Because the text does not suggest the choice was ever actually available to him, and that is the most terrifying thing in it. There is another figure in this story who has been waiting at the edge of every chapter, the unnamed mother, the woman whose womb was repurposed without her consent, who raised a weapon and loved him, who watched him walk away into the world his hair already made impossible, who lived long enough to see how it ended. The text gives her more words than it gives Delilah. It preserves her terror and her joy and her questions, and then it forgets her entirely. What she knew, and when she knew it, and whether the angel told her everything or only what she needed to hear, is a question the book of Judges left open. And it will matter more than you realize.